4.6, completing the square. So what is completing the square? Completing the square is forcing something to factor that does not factor. So of course, after saying that, we start with problems that you don't have to factor. But we're essentially just solving for x here. So if I look at A, what do I have to do to solve for x? Subtract 10. So I get 4x squared equals 36. What's the next step? Divide 4. So I end up with x squared equals 9. What's the last step? Square root. To undo a square, right, I square root. When you square root, do not forget the plus or minus. That's that annoying half point off if you forget the plus or minus. Should be working on your quiz, right? So I end up with x equals plus or minus 3. Done. So these are the easy problems before we complete the square. All you're doing is solving for x. It's like a regular linear equation, except now we have x squared, so it's a quadratic equation that we're going to square root as the last step. On this problem, I have to add 5 to both sides. And I get 3x squared equals 30. Then you divide both sides by 3. You get x squared equals 10. Then we're just going to square root both sides. Square root. Don't forget the plus or minus. Excellent. So x equals plus or minus square root of 10. So square root of 10 you cannot simplify. If you do square root of 10, you get like 3.16 something or other. But there are other square roots you may have to simplify. So I'm going to remind you of that as soon as I have people that are done writing this one. How to simplify square roots. So just going to new page, quick little shot on simplifying square roots. Because you'll see some of these square roots simplified in the answers, and it'll confuse you. You'll think you get it wrong when you didn't. So I make a little tree out of the square root of 8, and I'm thinking of the biggest factor of 8 that I can take the even square root of. Biggest factor of 8 that I can square root is 4. So I break down 8 into the square root of 4 times the square root of 2, right? These are always multiplication in between. Square root of 4 is 2. So if I simplify the square root of 8, that simplifies to 2 times the square root of 2. Okay? We'll do another one. Let's say I have square root of 32. What's the biggest factor of 32 that I can evenly square root? 16. So 16 times 2 is the square root of 32. The square root of 16 is 4. Square root of 2. Okay, so let's say you screw up and you didn't get 16 right here. And I just want to show you can still get the correct answer. So let's say I realized I could divide 32 by 4. So I had 4 times the square root of 8, which would be 2 times the square root of 8. I'm not done yet because I can still simplify square root of 8 like we did over here. So I would divide square root of 8 into square root of 4, square root of 2. And I still have that 2 in front. Remember, we're multiplying in between. So that becomes 2 times 2 times square root of 2, which is 4 square root of 2. So you can see how much faster it is over here if you get the biggest one to square root first versus not getting it, and it just costs you all those additional steps. But you can still get the right answer, so no huge deal. All right. We're going to do this one next. X squared plus 4x plus 4. So if you look at your half sheet of paper, we're starting at step 3 here. We have created a perfect square trinomial already. This up here is a perfect square trinomial because I can square root the x squared. I can also square root the 4. So what's the square root of x squared? X. What's the square root of 4? 2. I always take the sign from the b term and just bring it right down. Then that equals 25. How do I undo that square? Square root, both sides. Don't forget, plus or minus. So we end up with x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 5. This next step is where it goes wrong for some students, so you just got to be careful. A lot of you will think you can subtract 5 and 2. You can't because this plus or minus is in the way. So we end up with x equals negative 2 plus or minus 5, which it's basically two problems, one with the plus, one with the minus. So you have negative 2 plus 5, and you also have negative 2 minus 5. What's negative 2 plus 5? And negative 2 minus 5? Negative 7. So these are the two answers. Now, for me, I'd never show these two steps over here. I just do it from this spot. So you don't have to show this, right? You can just go up here and do negative 2 plus 5 is 3, negative 2 minus 5 is negative 7, call it good. But if it helps you to get it right to show those two steps, absolutely, go for it. Okay, so one more of that type, x squared minus 14x plus 49. Again, you're thinking of the square root of the a term and the square root of the c term. So we end up with x and 7. What's my sign in the middle? Do you have a question, Sky? Okay. Right? I take my sign from b. Just write it down. Then I square root both sides. So the only difference between this and the last problem is it's a minus instead of a plus. So we have x minus 7 equals plus or minus 5. Add 7 to both sides. We get x equals 7 plus or minus 5. So what's x equal? 12 and 2. So 7 plus 5 is 12, and 7 minus 5 is 2. I'll just show that step for anybody who needs it. So again, these are my two answers. So that's what solves x. That's what makes the two sides of the equal sign equal. This is also where if we made this into a parabola by subtracting the 25 over to the other side, if we graphed the parabola, it would cross the x-axis at 2 and 12. Okay, so trying to tie all this stuff together for you guys so you can understand how it all fits together. This is the entire completing the square. Example 4, x squared plus 4x minus 9 equals 0. So if you look at step 1 from your half sheet, what is the first step? Nope. Look at number 1 on your half sheet. Right, so we want to make the equation look like x squared plus bx. Leave your blank space. So essentially move the c over to the other side and leave your blank space after. So the first step I have to do on this problem is add 9 to both sides, because I want my C term on the right side of the equal sign. So we get x squared plus 4x. I'm going to leave my blank space here, equals 9, and leave my blank space after. So step 2 on your half sheet says do b over 2 squared. So what's b? 4 divided by 2 squared, which equals 2 squared, which equals 4. Many of you won't need to show this step over here. You can just do that, if you can do that in your head. 4 divided by 2 is 2, squared is 4. And then add your 4's to both spots. If you can do that in your head, it's totally fine. So now it looks just like the second and third example we did. So we're square rooting the x squared, we're square rooting the 4, and then we'll just combine like terms over here. But we end up with x plus 2 squared. Again, remember, we're taking that sign from b. It's the same sign always in those parentheses. And 9 plus 4 is 13. Then we just square root both sides. Don't forget plus minus. You get x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 13. What's the last step? Yeah. Minus 2. So we end up with x equals negative 2 plus or minus square root of 13. I prefer that you leave it like that, because that's the most accurate answer you can get. Because if you do square root of 13, it's about 3.6, right? Because square root of 9 is 3, square root of 16 is 4. That's closer to 16 than 9. So that's how I know it's 3.6, a little over halfway. Okay? And it could be 3.7, but it's probably 3.6. If you need to solve for decimals, like on SAT or anything like that, you can just do it like this, right? Negative 2 plus square root of 13, you get that. And then you can hit second enter and plug this in again and just switch the sign here to minus, and then you get that negative 5.6. You might see that on SAT where they give the decimal equivalent. That's fine. You can do it like that. Okay, so these ones are the easy completing the square because b is an even number. We're going to do one more with b as an even number, and then do one with an odd number, and it just introduces a whole slew of fractions into the fun. But this is the easy one still. So first thing we're going to do is what? Add 12 to the other side. So plus 12, and we get x squared plus 10x. Leave your blank space, equals 12. Leave your blank space. What's b over 2 squared? 25, right? So again, if you can do that in your head and just add 25 right here and here, because 10 divided by 2 is 5, squared is 25. That's good. If you need to show this step, b over 2 squared equals 10 over 2 squared, which equals 5 squared, which equals 25. That's fine too. So what does the left side factor to? X plus 5 squared, right? So square root of this, square root of that, you get x plus 5 squared equals 37. So nobody's asked it yet, but probably somebody's thinking it. Where did the 10 go? Right? So just if I do a little over to the side thing here, and do x plus 5 times x plus 5 using the box method that you learned if you were in my class freshman year. You may or may not remember. You get x squared plus 5x plus 5x plus 25. So that 10x is still there. We're just rewriting it as x plus 5 squared, because then I go from 2 x's to 1x, and I can solve for that single x by taking the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus as always. Then we get x plus 5 equals plus or minus square root of 37. Last step, subtract that 5 over, and we get x equals negative 5 plus or minus square root 37. Do we just think square root of 25 is 5? You can also look here for the step right before you square it is always going to be the number that goes right here. That's actually a handy concept for this next one we're going to do with an odd b, because we'll want to look back here to figure out what the square root of this fraction mess is going to be. Okay, so that 10x is still there, right? We're just rewriting it as x plus 5 squared so we can solve for x. All right, last example already. There you go. So I already did that first step of adding the 11 over to both sides. Give you a sec to write that down. And now we're going to do the b over 2 squared thing. So in this case, it's 7 over 2. So when you're squaring a fraction, both the 7 and 2 have an exponent of 1. When the exponent is immediately outside of the parenthesis, like it is here, then we're just kind of distributing that parenthesis and multiplying by the 1. So it's 7 squared over 2 squared, or 49 over 4. That is what we're going to add to our two blank spaces. So plus 49 over 4 plus 49 over 4. So what's the square root of 49 over 4? 7 over 2, right? So we're just looking right here, because we squared it on this step. So if I want to figure out what it is square rooted, I just look one step up. So this left side becomes x plus 7 over 2 squared. And now we have to add this whole number and fraction. And we do that by multiplying to get a common denominator. So the only denominator we have here is this 4. The 1 you can multiply by 1, but it doesn't matter, right? So this fraction over here becomes 44 over 4 plus 49 over 4. So now I have a common denominator. And when I add two fractions, all I do is add the numerator, leave the denominator alone. So what I get is 93 over 4. The handy part, if there is one, of this, you're always going to multiply by 4 over 4 right there. Every single time. And we always know we're going to multiply by 4 over 4 because I'm always squaring this 2 in the denominator. I will always get the 4 in the denominator. The numerator will change, but the 4 will always be in the denominator. Okay? And then when I look over here, we can just square root both sides. And important that you square root top and bottom on the right. And I'm square rooting top and bottom because 4 square roots evenly. So I end up with x plus 7 halves squared equals plus or minus square root of 93 over 2. Yeah?
So the 7x you use from the front after you get the 7 over 2, you don't use 7x again?
Yeah, it's just like we were saying don't use the 7x again. It's still there, just like the previous example, right? Because if we do, we'd have 7 halves x plus 7 halves x in this diagonal here, which would equal 7x. Okay, so I should have taken off this square right here, because I did take the square root. And then the very last step is just to subtract 7 halves from both sides. And we get x equals negative 7 halves plus or minus square root of 93 over 2. So easy. It's a nightmare, right? If you look at this example, versus this one, it just makes it a whole lot more fun. Or not fun, depending on your perspective. More fun for me. I'm a math teacher, right? Okay, so that is it. Your homework, actually, let's display the homework on here. Your homework's right here on the board. 10 whole problems. I recommend you bust a move and get her done right now. It's 2:31, and you can probably finish it if you're diligent in your work. Yep.